As we step away from our investigation of the physical world and begin to inquire into the nature of consciousness, we should ask, why do we even need to divide these two ideas, our primary suspects in this hunt for natural origin? Well, firstly, on this topic of consciousness, the shorelines of our understanding margin pools that are far shallower than the depths of the material sciences. A drought so severe that we can't even claim to know which school of thinking is best equipped to investigate consciousness in the first place. But the main reason we are forced to consider consciousness on its own terms is for the simple reason that the material sciences were themselves each discovered, defined and translated via this lens of consciousness. As humanity has continued to extend the reach of its senses, it has always been led by expectations born of experience, resulting in a science that is now, and perhaps always will be, more a reflection of us than of our world. But if that is the case, is a knowledge of worlds beyond experience even possible? Indeed, coming to terms with this skepticism is precisely the history of Western philosophy, no less than the great dilemma of metaphysics. So, how do we reorientate our inquiry? What should one first establish before attempting to seek the bounds of consciousness? Well, as I see it, as we found with our preliminary inquiry into the nature of time, should it now only make sense to continue with our task of defining the nature of self? So join me as I attempt to unpick the infinities of what is. What is it that makes our experience so subjectively human? As a species, we seem relatively confident of our unique worldly perspective, a perspective that has allowed us to imagine new realities and communicate ideas beyond the norms of day-to-day experience. Not to mention our access to an apparently unique palette of emotions which, due to their complexity, are considered by many to be more valid, special, and perhaps even more real than those of any other species. I'm sure that most of us can admit that we all adhere to at least some level of species privilege. Even the most committed Hindu or animal rights activist wouldn't hesitate to kill a poisonous insect had it accidentally wandered into their baby's cot. And even if we did feel poorly for the suddenly departed arthropod, it would still be rare for someone to dwell on it as excessively as had the necessary sacrifice been of another human. The core belief across millennia has been that humanity is made in no less than the image of God himself. So when it comes to translating the nature of reality, we each tend to suspect that humanity is the one holding all aces. Quite casually we declare our dominance of the intellectual hierarchy, often citing our impressive brain-to-body ratio as evidence. Though if this were the ultimate standard of intelligence, it should be pointed out that it would be the dolphins and other large cetaceans that would end up holding the winning hand. Or fins, as the case may be. Even our dearly departed cousins the Neanderthals boasted a more impressive cranium than our own. On a somewhat unrelated side note, the animal known to have the smallest body-to-brain ratio, as if to add insult to injury, is called the bony-eared arsefish. The grace of we, the rational animal, at our best. But though there is some truth that a higher brain-to-body ratio results in a higher degree of intelligence, it's not the be-all and end-all. Ask any neurologist, it's not the size that counts, it's how you use it. And though many studies have attempted to measure the discernible differences between species and these varying levels of intelligence, deciphering what correlations exist between intelligence and consciousness, has proved a much more arduous task even to begin. Consciousness is something we are all intimately familiar with. It is everything we know, everything we are. And yet, for millennia, it has proven fiercely difficult to pin down. The one correlation we do tend to draw between intelligence and consciousness is their relation to the complexity of our emotions. Complex social emotions being the shorthand answer to our question, what makes us human? The more complex a species' narrative of the world, i.e., the more layered their emotional experiences, the higher many tend to regard their ability to translate reality accurately, and therefore their quality of consciousness. And as the self-declared higher conscious beings we are inclined to feel relatively justified in such a criterion, even if we do place ourselves in the pole position. Recent studies have begun to show how these complex social emotions may stem from the existence of a peculiar set of brain cells nicknamed spindle cells. Named after their spindly appearance, their official title is von Economo neurons, named after anatomist Constantin von Economo, who first recognized them in humans in 1926. These spindle cells are thought to be a type of mental slip lane that allows for information to be expedited from regions specific to emotion and self-awareness to the rest of the brain, thus assisting in our rapid navigation of our complex social environments. Even at first glance, the unique attributes of these cells are obvious. As in contrast to the multitudinous natures of most cells, spindle cells only have a single tapered dendrite used to send signals, and a single apical axon used to receive them. They're also much larger than ordinary neurons. Though initially thought only to exist in humans, they have since been discovered in other branches of the great ape family, as well as some far more distant relations with similarly large brains. Their appearance in elephants, bottlenose dolphins, and multiple whale species suggests that their independent emergence has occurred in response to the limitations of speed over distance that goes hand in hand with the much larger surface areas of these bigger brains. Though evolving in our lineage much more recently, they do, however, appear in humans in much greater numbers. Whereas our closest mammalian relations will only host a few thousand, humans host up to 500,000, the majority of which appear to highlight connectivity between the anterior cingulate and the frontal insular cortex, and it's this particular circuit that suggests a connection to emotion, social behaviour, self-reflection, and importantly, self-awareness. In studies led by neuroanatomist Professor John Allman, correlations have been shown between spindle cells and a species' ability to empathise, and even an ability to recognise themselves in mirrors. In human studies, further correlations have been noticed between spindle cell irregularity and cases of autism, and even neurological diseases like dementia, where sufferers often display a loss of empathy, erratic behaviour, and the inability to retain their sense of social etiquette. Post-mortem examinations showed that 70% of these cells had been destroyed, whilst surrounding cells had, for the most part, remained unaffected. Other studies have also started to draw correlations between cases of suicide and a higher than average density of spindle cells. But yet, these curiosities comprise of only 1% of the human brain. Regardless, this is precisely the type of evidence that science seeks when attempting to answer the mysteries of consciousness. What are the measurable differences between what we experience and what some other entity may experience? As we have already shown, the brain is the measurable, physical reflection of what we experience, and of course, the more we understand its workings, the more precise our definition of these phenomena can become. But we must still be very cautious when using this reasoning, as science only ever draws our attention to its particular perspective, that of the mechanics only. Again, as we measure, we contain our descriptions to the finite, inevitably offering theories for new boundaries. And though we may gain a broader understanding of these finite phenomena, Rarely do they offer any clarity on the ultimate nature of things. The fundamental issue is that, regardless of how detailed our mechanical descriptions become, there still remains a disconnect between the mechanics and the resulting experience. What's referred to in philosophy as qualia, the quality of how something feels. But modern philosophy has been very clever in approaching this disconnect, giving it a name that boldly describes the vastness of the issue at hand. They call it, pause for dramatic effect, the hard problem. The hard problem of consciousness, as defined by Australian philosopher David Chalmers, points out that there are two sides to our understanding of consciousness. Firstly, there's the easy problem, which describes the task set before neuroscientists as they attempt to understand the functional attributes of the physical brain and its relationship to behaviour. Then there is the hard problem, which attempts to describe the underlying nature that ultimately gives rise to experience. One way to first see it is via the knowledge argument offered in the Mary's Room thought experiment, which goes like this. Mary is a brilliant neurophysiologist who studies the nature of vision. She understands all that is to be known regarding the wavelengths of light and their relationship to sight. She understands how light waves are detected in the eye's retina and how this information is then sent down neurological pathways and into the visual cortex, which converts the said information into a corresponding experience of brightness and colour. She understands it all. However, Mary was born blind. She has never experienced the redness of red or the blueness of blue. Regardless of the depth of her understanding, she cannot come to any revelation that can evoke an understanding of this quality we call colour. That knowledge is somehow independent, only coming to the fore via the conscious experience. And the point is that this trait proves true for all aspects of our conscious experience. But though many experts do support Chalmers' description of the hard problem, there are equally as many among neuroscientists and other like-minded reductive materialists who feel quite confident that a complete mechanistic understanding of the brain shall inevitably prove perfectly sufficient in describing a complete theory of mind. And so we should, at least for now, entertain the boundaries suggested by that more physicalist interpretation of mind, if for nothing else, to simply see where it leads us. Because though consciousness does seem to exist, the answers as to how, why, and for what purpose remains entirely unclear. So then, what attempts have been made to measure consciousness? Any measurable descriptions of mind always tend to tread along one of two axes. The complexity of experience, as in the distinction between humans and lesser animals, and secondly, the variability of awakened states, as shown in our earlier discussion regarding differing brainwave patterns. Or, more simply put, the conscious non-conscious axis and the conscious subconscious axis, both with their own hypothesized boundaries. So, let's start by dissecting the former, comparing our experience to both our evolutionarily close and then evolutionarily distant terrestrial cousins. Okay, so, though much of our discussion has been focused primarily on human experience, we now must make it painfully clear that we are not the pinnacle of evolution, and never have we been. Neither are we the most up-to-date or final word on consciousness. 3.5 billion years ago, our shared ancestor haphazardly drifted above the ocean floor, as did the ancestor of the aardvark, the gum tree, and the bony-eared arsefish. And in each case, this was the same individual, an organism now referred to as Luca, the last universal common ancestor. But this wasn't the Earth's first attempt at life. Indeed, Luca was only one of many organisms that competed for its survival in the ancient oceans of the Paleoarchean. But today, a mere 3.5 billion years later, Luca's descendants remain the sole survivors of that once competitive bygone era. A survival story represented without exception by every single living thing on Earth today. From every moss to every mosquito to every messiah, the branches of evolution share an intimate and unbreakable equality. So that from its root to its tip, till the very last earthling stands, there shall never be a front runner for the world's most evolved, as we are each unique expressions of that same single entity. An organism endlessly reshaped by an unfathomable slew of environmental challenges and one critical ability to reinvent itself. All characteristics of life, no matter how incorporeal, have been arrived at through this ancient game of trial and error. A game with a single rule that states, if you are still in the race, then you are tied for first place. Even death itself is an evolutionary answer to the problem of survival. In fact, some creatures still trial the potential benefits of immortality. Turritopsis dornii, a jellyfish discovered in the Mediterranean in the 1880s, has been shown to have the remarkable ability to endlessly revert from its sexually mature medusa stage back to its juvenile polyp stage when facing harsh conditions. The upshot of this transdifferentiation is that, save from death by predator or disease, the jellyfish is biologically immortal. So, as far as we can tell, there is no reason why we should have to die at all, except for the simple fact that it gives our species an evolutionary edge. As flowers shed their petals to ensure the survival of the flower, so too do our old or unhealthy cells suicide by way of apoptosis, maintaining a healthy biome. The word apoptosis literally meaning falling of the flower petals. And by dying ourselves, we ensure that the species doesn't overcapitalize on its limited resources, whilst advancing the genetic variety needed to deal with the many biological and environmental challenges that a species may face. Death is simply an inherited trait. And by this measure, so it appears, is consciousness. The evolutionists' take is that consciousness is merely a survival mechanism which turned out to be more successful than baseline chemical reactions alone. If an organism evolved the ability to move towards a food source or away from a predator with something that we would recognize as purpose, then it therefore had developed a basal notion of self, the fundamentals of what might one day build towards consciousness. So how might we begin to describe what it is that has arisen from this evolutionary process? When discussing the evolution of consciousness, we have, quite understandably, chosen to begin with what we know, i.e., the thinking that justifies the I am. But even as we take our first step out of the gate, debate can rage even here, as we can never be entirely sure that any human other than ourselves are conscious. Maybe I am the only one. Maybe you are. But if we do allow ourselves to take that liberty, and I think we should, it makes sense to then move on to our closest mammalian relatives, where we can start to look for anything we might consider familiar. In Melbourne Museum, sitting somewhat out of the way, is an old and rather underwhelming exhibit. Inside its ornate 19th century glass cabinet, hunched over in a curious pose of dominance, is a fairly aggressive and yet rather lifeless looking family of gorillas. Today, The majority of museum goers simply stroll past, for the most part ignoring the display entirely. But in 1865, these beasts were a national sensation, as they were the first gorillas ever to be seen by the Australian public. This hype surrounding this small family of apes, father, mother and child, was so great that it enticed intellectuals and sticky beaks to journey across the country in the hope that they may gawk at these strange and alien simians. Their emotional debut, however, was heightened by the decade's socio-political backdrop and the ripples still being felt as a result of Charles Darwin's book The Origin of Species, published only 6 years prior. It was the museum's first director and professor of natural sciences at Melbourne University, Frederick McCoy, who along with his colleague sought to bring these great apes to Australia. Surprisingly, however, this captivating display of the natural sciences was acquired by McCoy with the sole intention of proving once and for all how very wrong Darwin was. Quote, "It is well for the inhabitants of a country so remote, under ordinary circumstances, from the chance of seeing actual specimens of this, the greatest and most manlike of the anthropomorphous apes, to see how infinitely remote the creature is from humanity, and how monstrously writers have exaggerated the points of resemblance when endeavouring to show that man is only one phase of the gradual transmutation of animals." End quote. And though we would be hard-pressed to find any professor of the natural sciences who still agrees with McCoy's comments, over 150 years later, the concept of evolution still has to fight for its integrity within the minds of the greater global community, with the highest of these anthropocentric views being recorded in countries that host high numbers of fundamentalists, such as the US and Turkey. But unlike in McCoy's time, we no longer have to daydream over the rare black and white sketches that appear in newspapers, or ogle the few vaguely accurate taxidermists' impressions of creatures which they themselves have never seen alive. And though our modern zoos are still a long stretch from the natural habitats of gorillas, bonobos, or chimpanzees, we each now have the ability, whenever we so choose, to take an afternoon and witness these majestic creatures in real life. And so it is that the human mind dances when looking into the living eyes of a chimpanzee. So much of us, so much of home. But all too quickly, as if startled from a dream, we snap and lift ourselves out of the trance. We straighten up. A mere childish game of wishful thinking it must be to think that it could ever know the way I know, or love the way I love, grieve the way I grieve. But still, look at those hands. Look at the way the mother cares for her child, the way the children watch, learn and play, and how the adults walk their daily tightrope of care and competition. And then, as if this wasn't already enough, we recall and wonder at the 98.77% of our shared genetic makeup and try and imagine what that 1.23% difference might mean for the way they see their world. And at this, though still an immense leap across the evolutionary ravine, in our heart of hearts, we can all still see it. This is family. Of course, we have inherited a specific creativity and symbolization which they have not. One that has led to the development of our words, cultures and society. But it's also true that these apes have inherited an equally unique palette of cognitive skills, many of which surpass our own. For example, where our mental advantage arose in symbolization, chimps, alternatively, gained a cognitive upper hand in areas such as their immediate memory skills. Studies run by primatologist Dr. Tetsuro Matsuzawa at the Kyoto University in Japan have shown how young chimps who have been trained through a simple reward system can rapidly recall both the location and numerical order of numbered icons 1 through 9 after the numbers had flashed upon the screen for less than a second. Humans attempting to play the same game seldom recall the locations of even the first few numbers. But rather than our differences, it is our similarities which so intrigue us. Even when it comes to our prized traits of love and grief, do we witness this mutual kinship? Mother chimps have been seen mourning over their children's bodies days after their passing, and males who lose out in cases of internal power struggles are often comforted by other troop members, a trait that has turned out to play just as crucial a role in defining social balance as the fighting itself. So here, along this parallel branch of evolution, do we have a convex mirror? One which can reflect the outer blurry borders of what we do and what we do not consider human. But though we can tread this line of uniqueness, aren't those shared traits, such as those critical complex social emotions, evidence enough to attribute consciousness to this other species? Because if we are happy enough to accept the theory that all humans are conscious in the same way we find ourselves to be, then must we not be forced to attribute at least some version of consciousness to our closest relatives? I consider this to be unequivocally evident. But there is a slippery slope that often interjects at this point, which tends to argue along the following line. The line of reasoning being, of course the chimpanzee is conscious, as yes, you can clearly see how their emotions reflect our own. But surely this is a shifting scale. A chimp, though conscious, would not be as conscious as a human, just as an ant would not be as conscious as a chimpanzee. So, to determine whether this argument has any validity or not, we need to first determine what we mean by that amorphous word consciousness. Because in the above statement, I would argue that we are again confusing consciousness with intelligence. Intelligence being the level of complexity we can interpret via the senses. Since if consciousness were to be considered hierarchical in this way, would that not suggest that there is also a shifting scale of consciousness between individual humans? That a level of consciousness must vary between highly intelligent people and those who have a mental disability? Or between a focused athlete and a staggering drunk, perhaps? Or even between a baby and an adult? No, I would not agree with this. Both baby and ape are conscious. It's just that they're experiencing different aspects of consciousness. Therefore, I would, at this point, claim that we must define consciousness as a state that either is or isn't, rather than a state that can be either less or more. Now, I am aware that many would happily argue that the ant is not intellectually capable of being conscious. But again, this confuses intelligence with consciousness. It confuses hierarchy with variety. As a flower can be measured by the brightness of its petals, the quality of its pollen, or by the smell of its bouquet, we cannot state that there is one particular flower that is the most flower. As said before, if you're still in the race, you are tied for first place. So, though we may pick and choose the various mental attributes that we consider worth measuring, we cannot yet say that there is a better or worse version, nor a more complete or incomplete version of consciousness. There's simply my experience, and then there's yours. There's the experience from the point of view of a chimpanzee, and the experience from the point of view of the ant. Not to mention each and all of these individual perspectives as they themselves change through time. Though it is with this plethora of variety that we are now offered an interesting parallel to our prior discussions, such that we can now ask, Is the nature of consciousness digital or analog? Specifically, what would each of these classes have to say about the hierarchy that I have just denied? Because, in contrast to my claim, a digital atomistic model of consciousness would instead suggest that there is a smallest unit of consciousness. And so this is a hypothesis that we must further inquire into across the coming chapters. However, if such a hierarchy is, as I have claimed, only a confusion for intelligence, then it appears that I must also be claiming that consciousness should be likened to a continuum. Now, this is not a straightforward idea, but it's by no means impossible to follow. Simply consider a number line starting at 0, stretching into infinity. If we metaphorically liken consciousness to the atomistic model, then 0 is non-consciousness, 1 is its simplest unit, and any number above is its increase. But assuming that this is a confusion for intelligence, we instead liken consciousness to the continuum. In this metaphor, the quantifiable value of numbers would be akin to intelligence, whereas consciousness itself would be more suitably considered the entire uninterrupted number set. In this case, the divide between 0 and 1, with its endless count of rational and irrational decimal places, would be equal to the count of real numbers between 0 and 1 million, 1 trillion, or any number, since infinity plus any number is always the same infinity. The point is, no number on the number line would ever have a position that is either closer to or further away from 0, i.e. more or less closer to non-consciousness. But further, this would also suggest that the hierarchy would be an illusion. The quantifiability of intelligence would only be relative to those who decided what intelligence was. Again, if you're in the race, you are tied for first place. But either way, which model best suits the data is something we are now forced to investigate. But it should be kept in mind that at this early point, our problems have more to do with our use of language than anything metaphysical. All that we are doing is defining what it is we wish to define. In my description, I am choosing to give the word consciousness a definition that linguistically should be used more like the word alive rather than intelligent, as something cannot be more or less alive, whereas it can be more or less intelligent. This is because the definition attempts to describe the whole phenomenon, rather than just a sliding scale attribute of its makeup. But even as a linguistic boundary, it does still highlight the metaphysical question. If consciousness is only on or off, what is its limit?